Hello. In this talk, I'm going to be thinking about Western Christendom as it was on the eve of the First Crusade. And I'm going to be looking at a whole range of different developments and events that have been connected by different scholars in different ways to the evolution of the First Crusade. Now, what I'm not doing here is trying to explain Urban II's reasons for launching the First Crusade, or indeed the motivations of those who went. Just bigger contextual and background factors that are worth knowing about to make sense of the First Crusade when you come to study it. So, to begin with, let's look at the big picture. Now, before the first millennium, so in the 800s and 900s, Western Christendom had been under attack on multiple frontiers. In the north, they'd been under attack from the Vikings, whose raids had affected much of the coastal region of northern Germany, France, as well as many of the rivers in France as well, which the Vikings often sailed down to stage their attacks, the British Isles, and indeed even further south into the Iberian Peninsula or into the Baltic region. Then in the east, areas like the Empire of Germany was under attack from a range of peoples down its eastern border, and there was an ongoing conflict in that region. And then in the south, in this area, there were many attacks staged by Muslim forces, whether the states of North Africa or indeed the Umayyad Caliphate in Iberia. And by Iberia, I'm talking about the region that today would be modern-day Spain and Portugal. Nevertheless, in the years before the first millennium, and then certainly after the first millennium, the situation begins to change. The Vikings begin to convert to Christianity. Their raids cease. And indeed the Normans, or Northmen, which is where the word comes from essentially, begin to play a role not just attacking Western Christendom, but actually in championing its interests on a range of different frontiers. And the Normans were to play a very important role in the conquest of Sicily, for example, in the Mediterranean region, and indeed they played a major role on the First Crusade as well. And then along Christendom's eastern frontiers, you have the conversion of many peoples along this frontier and the rise of new kingdoms such as the Kingdom of Hungary and the Kingdom of Poland, among others. So here again, it's a mixture in this case of sort of warfare and conversion, but Christendom's frontiers begin to expand. And then in the south, in Iberia and the Mediterranean, again, it's a story of expansion. In the Mediterranean itself, formerly, it had been Muslim commercial fleets or Muslim war fleets who had controlled most of the sea lanes. But increasingly that begins to change in the 11th century as Italian war fleets operating out of cities such as Pisa, Venice and Genoa become increasingly assertive, not just as maritime military powers, but also with their commercial strength as well. Likewise, many of the small Christian kingdoms in the mountainous northern regions of Iberia begin to push south, seeking to conquer more land in central Iberia. And so there is a big picture here, and that big picture is one of expansion. Now let's look at some religious developments. Now Western Christendom in this era is predominantly Catholic Christian. There are various communities of Jews and also Muslims in some areas, but for the most part Catholic Christians are the predominant population across much of the area. But there are developments in the way in which people are expressing their faith, and these are connected in various ways to what will become the crusading movement. For a start, pilgrimage to Jerusalem expands considerably. Now, of course, Jerusalem is immensely sacred, and yet the practice of going on pilgrimage and the spiritual importance attached to that seems to expand as the 11th century goes on. And this is facilitated, at least in part, by the opening up of the land route by which people can go through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire and then ultimately south down to Jerusalem. But pilgrims seem to have been flocking to Jerusalem in ever-increasing numbers. And that's an important development, and of course they're bringing back news of what's going on there. Now, In the area around Jerusalem at this time, pilgrims from Western Christendom were welcome to visit the city. The authorities in control of Jerusalem for much of this period was the Fatimid Empire, although increasingly Jerusalem became a frontier of war with the Seljuk Sultanate, which also controlled Jerusalem at some points. And the Fatimids were prepared to let pilgrims visit Jerusalem in return for paying taxes, but it seems to have been a reasonably stable situation. Even so, there are difficulties here. The fact that the Jerusalem area does become a frontier zone, with the Seljuks to the north and the Fatimids to the southwest, pilgrimage to Jerusalem becomes increasingly disrupted. Also, as the Fatimid Empire becomes consumed by infighting in the middle of the 11th century, that may also have had an effect on the pilgrim routes. There are also some instances of persecution against local Christian communities, but often these are very much situated at the earlier part of the 11th century. But these are all developments, and these all show that Western Christendom is beginning to look at Jerusalem in a much more focused way than before. And indeed, it's during this time that you have the establishment of the hospital in Jerusalem, which in time will evolve into the Knights Hospitaller. Another important development is the emergence of the Reform movement. Now, in the centuries before the first millennium, the Church increasingly found it difficult to exert its authority over the various institutions of the Church around Western Christendom, and it had a number of complaints. The first was that kings or dukes or counts or countesses or queens were exerting undue influence over the Church, particularly in the business of appointments. So who gets appointed to being a bishop, who gets appointed to being an archbishop. And the Church felt very strongly that it should have control over who are its major officers across the various regions of Western Christendom. The Church also wanted to ensure that the clergy across much of Western Christendom were adhering to its set of values, and one particular complaint was the concern that in some areas church appointments were being sold to people who would pay for them and then take on that church office and the incomes that went with it, which was considered to be a considerable problem and deeply sinful. And so you have the rise of what becomes known as the Reform movement, which in its essence is the Church's desire to bring the behaviour of its clergy into closer conformity with its own set of values, but also to gain greater control over the Church and to wrest that control away from the kings or queens or the German emperor, who may have been exerting, as far as they're concerned, undue influence on church appointments. And this reform movement gathers momentum as the 11th century progresses. Now, it's not linked to the idea of holy war per se, but it is very much to do with the Church attempting to restate its authority and restate the system of values that it considers to be especially important. And indeed, Urban II, or before him popes like Gregory VII, were very concerned about this as a major priority. And indeed, when Urban launched the First Crusade, he was actually in competition at that time with an anti-pope established by the German emperor, who was a threat to his authority. And so we have to ask ourselves, is there context in this for the Crusade as a whole? Another important development is a growing awareness of the needs of the Byzantine Empire. Now, throughout the 11th century, the Byzantines sent many letters or emissaries seeking support from Western Christendom. And what the Byzantines were normally looking for were mercenaries, and large numbers of mercenaries went to Byzantium to seek service. The Byzantines paid very well, so there was a very obvious opportunity for various warriors, and particularly in southern Italy and Sicily, which the Normans conquered during this period, many Normans from that area took service with the Byzantines. Also, so did many from the Kingdom of England as well as from other areas. But there is this awareness that the Byzantines are deeply embattled, and indeed they are asking for help on a number of fronts. And then there's also the business of infighting, because particularly in the Kingdom of France, and of course Pope Urban II himself was born into an aristocratic French family, there's a great deal of low-level fighting. And by low-level, I mean noble families fighting each other, local villages or towns and their militias fighting each other, and the church considered this form of violence to be deeply sinful. And therefore the church went to great lengths to try and end this infighting, end these vendettas between feuding families. And to this end, it created a series of movements known as the Peace and Truce of God movements. And these did a range of things, either trying to limit the violence or to end it. And so the church tried to set up peace militias. And the idea was that these peace militias would forcibly prevent protagonists from fighting against each other. The church also did things like actually set days in the week when fighting was strictly prohibited, in the hope that even if it couldn't stop the violence, at least it could create a space in the week when farmers could sort out their crops or artisans could trade their wares without the fear of being attacked or becoming embroiled in conflict. But it's not a problem the papacy really manages to solve, so it remains very much an open problem by the time of the First Crusade. And so that raises by extension the question of, well, does that have a relevance for the First Crusade and the reasons why it was launched? Okay, so that provides you with a brief overview of some of the key developments taking place in Western Christendom at this time. One other development I could have talked about here is the whole question of religious warfare, because of course Christianity is the religion where Jesus told his disciples and his followers to love each other, to do good to those that hate you, to turn the other cheek. And so there is a question here as well over how did the church get to a place where it felt that launching a holy war was something that God might actually want as far as they're concerned. Now, I'm not going to deal with that in this lecture. I'm going to be covering that in a separate talk. But I do want to flag up that that is also another big development that needs to be borne in mind, but I shall be covering that later. Okay, so I do hope you found this video useful. Please do have a look at the other videos in this collection.